Welcome to week 3 of Nonprofit Human Resources. This session is focused on developing healthy employee interactions. Angie Kreiner, who's an HR consultant, has worked with over 70 nonprofits, is going to be explaining how to have healthy employee interactions. So Angie, thank you for sharing with us. So do you want to just start us off?
Sure, I'd be happy to. In the nonprofit sector, one of the things that I absolutely love and I feel affords us great strength and uniqueness is to truly focus on the employee relations piece. And so that really comes down to some relational competence, because if you establish some strong relationships up front with your employees, then when you need to have the more challenging or difficult or hold accountable conversations, you've already built some relational trust into that relationship. And so they should be easier conversations to have. And taking a look at relational competence, we're talking about trust. The things that go into that are both environment or culture and relationships and accountability. The more trust, the more trust that exists because of the relationships, the easier accountability is to work through with someone else. It is more of a doing with as opposed to doing to approach in interactions. So.
Yeah, that's great. And how this fits in, what we're trying to do is train students in the employee life cycle. So you've hired someone, you've onboarded them. How do you have deep trust? So you have, a deep emotional bank account. So you don't get to that point where either you have to quickly fire them or have them quit because the relationship's bankrupt. So yeah.
Correct. And even like we talked about, I think last week on onboarding, that is such a fantastic opportunity to begin to model exactly what matters to you as an organization. And even though to you it may seem like a minor thing if you have to reschedule or bump or cut short those check-in appointments with new employees, don't discount those. Those are absolute deposits into this relational trust and robust relationship. So those things matter. So employee relations, I think, is honestly one of the most fun parts of all of HR. It's great. It's that relationship piece. And we sit in such a unique role, whether you're the manager or the HR person, to really advocate, support, educate, come around your employee, as well as holding the line, growing engagement, keeping people focused on the organizational end goal. And so that's a really fun thing to be able to do. In nonprofits, we are not as much of a policing entity. In the corporate world and in the government world, that is the vast majority of what the HR function is. And so we need to consciously be mindful that employees historically often think that if HR calls them, they're going to the woodshed. It's not a good experience. And so I've often found myself saying, we are not about just that side of it. I mean, we are interested in helping you navigate your career path within our organization well. We hired you because we see value in that. And so it is a little bit of a re-education. And again, your greatest opportunity to really pour into that initially is in that front onboarding first few months of employment. In nonprofits, and certainly in religious organizations, we take on a far more central and primary role with regard to relationships. And so that becomes something that drives it. Commonly, I can just give you a common example. When a new employee starts and they see all their benefits, they don't tend to fully understand those benefits, but seldom will employees voice that they don't understand those benefits. Most people don't understand how an HSA functions or an FSA functions. And so taking a few extra minutes to ensure that an employee understands that goes a long way, because it has a direct impact on their personal life. And it shows a level of care and concern from the organization in the individual employee, that the individual employee then tends to reciprocate back into their quality of work and their connectedness within the organization. So there is a direct correlation between managers and HR and the success and effectiveness with employees, depending on that investment in employee relations. The other real common thing that we don't always think about is as people are starting to work with us, make sure they have lunch plans. And I know that sounds really basic, but when you're a brand new employee and you're the new person on the job, if you have people to eat lunch with, and that's already been handled for you and you already felt welcome in the process rather than just kind of hoping someone invites you or making sure you've got a backup plan in case no one includes you, those things go a long way for employee relationship, relational competence, and inclusion and engagement in the relationship in the organization. The other thing that I think should really look different, not just as a nonprofit, but especially as a religious organization or ministry, is we don't always have a choice about what needs to be done in the context of HR or management of employees. But we always have choice about how we do it. And how we do it is key. That should line up with core values, desired culture, and individual value. What I mean is if an employee, you have to engage in a corrective conversation or a corrective meeting with an employee, we want to be mindful in ensuring that they understand why this is important, why this can't happen, and how we go about doing that, being respectful, but drawing it back to the core value and why that matters to the organization is the stuff we need to take time and do. Otherwise, it defaults to a very punitive thing. And again, it drives further distancing between HR and the employee or manager and the employee. So any opportunity that we have to do it differently, which is more aligned with why we exist, we need to take that opportunity.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that's a big difference between ministries and, the corporate world, is just the emphasis on caring for the employee and the relationship. We always say that, we're not just ministering to, those we're serving, we're also ministering to our staff.
Biggest part of ministry.
Yeah, right.
In a
Yeah,
lot of ways.
yeah.
Yeah. All right. So relationships play a critical part within religious nonprofits and are a significant contributor to the culture. If you take time to establish trust and relationship up front, kind of like we've said, it does create a better opportunity to be able to address challenging circumstances when they arise and to have a more favorable outcome. So, for example, a very common example that I've had is, especially within ministries, you've got an employee who means well, but in the spirit of praying for a coworker, broadcast personal medical information about a coworker. I'd like to bring up Susie. We all need to pray for her. She was just diagnosed with cancer. Okay, that's a total can't happen. And that is something that if another employee does, it's got to be addressed because it could do some serious damage to the culture, not to mention incur some unfortunate liability and other outcomes. So in doing that, it's part of the conversation that looks like, Jan, we know that you meant well and we know that you care deeply for Susie, but we need to remind you that that's not information that any employee is permitted to share unless it's their own personal information. And it's really important that you hold that confidentially because it could create for Susie a distancing. And if she wishes to share it, then she needs to be able to do so. But otherwise, it's important for us to model the compassion and the concern, the respect that we purport to all people, but that can't happen again. To still be able to have the direct conversation, but to understand the why around it. In that case, I think an employee is far more willing to go, oh my gosh, I didn't even think about that. I'm so scared for her. I just want to be able to pray for her. And we can say, we understand that, but in the workplace, we still have to honor these limitations and these boundaries. And the person has a much better opportunity then to navigate, to pivot, and to still come full circle, as opposed to, you were totally out of line. You're going to get written up for that. You should know better. We've said this before. Then they're kind of in more of a panic mode. And honestly, my experience is they tend to talk more about the situation, because now they feel like they went to the woodshed and they got busted, and they shouldn't be busted for such a good and godly thing. So it
Right.
kind of creates this distraction that becomes problematic as a whole. So that just kind of an example of a relatively common thing that happens. We want to focus on safe and healthy relationships and safe and healthy environments and culture. So
Yeah, and I mean, my guess is what I would advise in a situation like that is if someone shares something like that, I mean, part of it's just, so you got to recognize there's two lenses. One is having good boundaries, and the other, in a nonprofit, there's also a legal lens. And sometimes if you don't have good boundaries, that can create legal issues, I think is what you're pointing out. But good boundaries is anytime someone shares with you something significant, you ask, if you think, like, I'd like to have the rest of the staff, or, are you okay if I mention this to other staff? And then if they say okay, then that's one thing. But leaving it under their control and not all of a sudden doing. I think part of what makes that difficult is people are used to a church environment, and
right.
they're like, I'm going to pray for Sister Sally, right? And she shared this, and I think there's less boundaries there, and there aren't as much legal issues if it's one member sharing with another member. But then they go into a nonprofit where as I explained it, a nonprofit's both are a ministry, like Tech Mission or City Vision is in some ways like a business, in some ways like a church, and you have to recognize both of those. So yeah.
Right, right. And depending on your role, you have a higher level of accountability within that. So if you do sit in an HR role, you have an increased responsibility that looks at the legal lens. If you are the manager over somebody, you have a higher level of liability
Right.
or responsibility related to the legal lens. Yeah,
Yeah, that's great.
definitely.
Okay.
These are just some a couple of quotes that I think are really spot on, and why interpersonal competence does matter. Without interpersonal competence or a psychologically safe environment, the organization's a breeding ground for mistrust, intergroup conflict, and rigidity, which leads to a decrease in organizational success and problem solving. Um, this is an excellent book if anyone's interested in looking at it. It's called Ascent of a Leader, and it really does talk about kind of how things are different in nonprofits, but also ministry oriented nonprofits. Ken Blanchard really addresses things across the board, not just specific to nonprofits, but to a healthy workplace in general. And he notes that problems in organizations are more often about people's safety than about people talking to one another. And that when you create trust and safe environments, communication happens. One thing I notice that occurs a lot, and it requires constant proactive vigilance. And I will say it's kind of unfortunate that it does, but the reality I think is that it does, is that so often we become busy in the day-to-day needs, and we always have great needs. I mean, I don't know anyone who works in a nonprofit who has extra time, on a day-to-day basis. Everybody is busy. But I think one thing that's really critical in that is that when you pour into those relationships and something hits you wrong, rather than jumping to the worst case scenario or conclusion, we need to impose in ourselves the discipline to take that person aside and to say, I may have misunderstood this when you said this, but can you tell me kind of a little bit more about that? Or have I done something that has offended you that we need to talk about? Rather than just assuming, which happens way too often. I can't believe Andrew said that. He's totally rude. He thought that I was, he said that I did this and I didn't. I just think that we have to make it acceptable and welcome and normal in the workplace to afford people the benefit of the doubt and an opportunity for us to better understand what we very well may have misunderstood. And I think that goes a long way.
Yeah, that's great.
The reality check is we all make mistakes. We are humans. And if any of you guys are parents, you have a profound understanding of that. But it's true. I don't care if you're HR. I don't care if you're the CEO. I don't care if you're a manager. We are all humans and we all make mistakes. Secondarily, we all have a limited frame of reference. That is that we are primarily going to interact and interpret situations based on our current and existing frame of reference and our own experiences. The third thing is that we cannot do everything on our own. And this is so true in any organization, but it's especially true, I think, in nonprofits and ministry-based organizations. I say those things because once we have an awareness of them, we tend to be more, well, we should be more willing to take a pause before moving ahead in our solution. Our way is not always the right way or the only way. And there is real value in understanding that just because something may seem obvious to us to do, to solve, to fix, to just plow ahead with that is not always the best way to approach something for the individual or the environment or the workplace. There's real value in having others solve those things as well. And if they're not the exact same way that we would do it, it doesn't invalidate it as a very viable solution. And if you think about it, most of us learn from making missteps, not from making great steps every step of the way. I want to talk about the Johari window for just a minute, and this is fundamental in communication studies. So if any of you guys have college level coursework or training in communication, you've probably seen this. But what the Johari window says is that this quadrant, these quadrants are true for all people. So on the open self, that is the part of us that we know about ourselves and that others know about us. Okay, and we all have that bucket of information. The blind self, and this is true for all of us, that we don't recognize in ourselves, but others see in us. So, for example, maybe we come across to others as a bit harsh, but we don't see that in ourselves. So that's the blind self. Others see things in us that we may not see in ourselves. The hidden self are things that we know about ourselves that we don't want others to know. We all have things about us that we tend to keep private or secret. We just don't want others to know about us. And then there's an unknown self quadrant. And that is that it's as yet undiscovered or unknown, both by ourselves and other people. The premise behind the Johari window is that the more we are able to forge healthy relationships based on context, then the greater the opportunity to increase our understanding in areas, because we're able to receive and give feedback with those others in trusted relationships that are in our blind self and or to more fully discover in our unknown self. And so it creates a greater relational balance. It's a foundational health awareness in any relationship. So
Right. Yeah. And I just think about like a good deep marriage, what's going to happen is there's going to be those things about yourself that your spouse, drives them crazy and you may not even realize. And then they kind of bring it up and, you have to grow in. Right. And then the same thing on the hidden, there's things about yourself that you gradually disclose as there's more trust. And, you're not going to go that deep with people that you work with, but part of what trust happens is as you have more trust, you're going to be able to share more of, okay, by the way, you have this thing and this is how it affects me, right? And and the same thing with the hidden self. So I think that's really good. So
I think just to say one other practical example on this area is, especially with managers, the blind self can be something that really can be a hindrance. And yet to be able to be in a relationship in a workplace where we're able to get that feedback from other people and they're free to give it to us is a fantastic growth and deepening type of exchange. Commonly that I've seen it is a very high energy manager, very committed to the organization and their people. They come across, unbeknownst to them, but it feels very much to their direct reports like a steamroller. And that's something that is often a blind side that I've seen within organizations. They don't realize that they are a steamroller because they are knocking out the list, man. They're getting things done right and left. They're loving this energy. But the people that work for them feel often run over.
Right.
And when a manager's been able to receive that feedback, it has had fantastic outcome, the ability to pivot, to rein in, and to continue to move with some good pacing, but now inclusive of others rather than at the expense of others.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and one of the common things I see is that people who work in at-risk communities and with at-risk populations, a large portion have been hurt by people in position of power or abused. And so they always have this framework from that perspective, but then they get into a position of power and they don't recognize that now their voice is amplified tenfold. So any correction they have is tenfold, and they're still in this, perception of, no, I don't have power. And I think that's another, huge thing. So yeah,
yes,
so let's
great.
jump to this next
All
one.
right. So jumping to this, most of us are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy, right? And the first level of Maslow's hierarchy is safe and secure. And so this is something else that kind of works from a similar basis of relational competence. The first thing, ironically, is actually some vulnerability, being willing, appropriate to the context. So again, in a workplace, we don't spill our guts about everything to everybody all the time and turning it into counseling sessions and inappropriate disclosures. But vulnerability of, I may be in a management role, but there are still things that I need to learn. I hired you guys, or I'm glad you're part of my team because I think you bring some strengths where I've got weaknesses. And I would like for us to work together in this manner. Disclosing an appropriate level of vulnerability, even when you're in a position of management or HR where that's appropriate, is advantageous to building authenticity. Because now you don't come across as trying to be all things to all people. And then the third layer of that is then trust. Because when people then work back and forth, they begin to see that you are sincere in, if you did say, for example, hey, Andrew, I know that we're on the same team, and even though I hold the managerial position, I really need you to work with me and hold me accountable on these deadlines. That's one of those things that I know that in my busyness, I don't always track as well. So if you could really kind of watch out for me in that area, and then we can work together. Or, I want you to help hold me accountable here, or I need you to really pick up this part of this responsibility and run with it. It rolls into the authenticity as it actually happens, and then builds a trust. Anyone who's interested in looking into listening to something else along these lines, Brene Brown and her kind of original TED Talk had a fantastic 25-minute talk that talks about appropriate levels of vulnerability and building the authenticity, which then rolls into trust in terms of relational competence. So
Yeah, I think that may be one of the most widely viewed TED Talks of all time. And a lot of people don't realize Brene Brown's also a Christian, even though that, talk didn't go, deeply into that. Another great one is there's a book called 5 Dysfunctions of a Team.
yes.
And it talks about the same concept of you got to start by, with vulnerability and then work towards trust. And it has other levels that more are around, holding people accountable too. But I think that, this, and I think a lot of people assume that there's already trust whenever there isn't trust, whenever they're managing people. And if you're managing people who have abuse backgrounds, part of what's been challenging for me is the number of years it can take to build trust with someone, because if you're in a position of power, by definition, that kind of, especially if, it's cross-gender and, that person's been abused, by that gender or the same gender, that the person's been abused in that, or, other demographic factors that can affect the trust, and just recognize it takes a long time. And, trying to get an accurate read of that, recognizing that a lot of people, they grow up in patterns where they pretend to show trust because that they know that's what they're supposed to do, but they may not actually have trust. So that can create things that's really challenging. So Yeah.
It definitely can. And I would say again that the most successful way to work through that in a healthy manner is to demonstrate it.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
is to consistently pursue what that should look like. So
Yeah.
it's role modeled.
Yeah. That's
So,
great.
hey, just a quick question. You mentioned the 5 dysfunctions of a team. That's Lencioni, right?
Yeah.
Patrick
Yeah.
Lencioni?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, great. All right. So the this next slide quickly again comes out of the book The Ascent of a Leader that I referenced earlier. And what they say is that in a corporate environment, we're all very familiar with the climbing the ladder scenario or that example. And often what that common default climbing the ladder in the corporate world looks like is really one of competition. In order to be successful, you have to outclimb other people. And so what they introduce is really a different concept within ministries, and that's even applicable within nonprofits, that talks about a ladder that's more character driven as opposed to competence in terms of competitive driven. And it says that really the rails of those ladders are environments of grace and relationships of grace. I do want to talk real briefly and just say, grace has been a word that has been used a lot in the last handful of years, especially within ministry environments. And I think that it's important for you to define what that means for you in your workplace and in your philosophy of ministry, and to make sure that that is used in the hiring process. Because what I've come to see very, very often is that that is not a commonly defined term. So for me, I will say that one of the healthiest definitions that I've seen is grace is getting something that you don't deserve. And in order to function in a grace environment, it's got to involve truth and time and accountability. So it's not enabling. It's not like everyone gets a free pass on things, but for the purpose of this, that's kind of what I'm going with. So you may not be in charge of the entire environment. You don't probably get to um, determine what the whole workplace environment may look like, but you are responsible for your direct relationships, and that has an affect. Remember, people are the largest contributor to culture. So if you want to have a culture that is more grace infused, then you need to start with having relationships of grace, and that will in turn affect the environment. The rungs are trusting God and others with me, first of all. Second, to choose vulnerability. Third, align with truth. And that is largely aligned with the truth of the organization in terms of why the organization exists and the core values. Pay the price. Pay the price really means be willing to set yourself aside at times for the larger good. It doesn't, leadership, again, especially within many ministries, has that servant stewardship perspective. It's not me, 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 me. And then 5 is discover my destiny. We need to understand, I think, and accept that we are where we are because this is where we're supposed to be for now. It may be for 30 years, it may be for 3 months, but you've got to really be there and be open to accepting what it is you're supposed to contribute and leave, and what it is you're supposed to receive in order to move on to the next place that you need to be, or to be ready for what comes next to you where you are. All right, these are some fundamental employee interactions. Engage, coach, listen, give feedback and correction, follow up, and entrust. I think that we do the first 4 relatively mindfully well, but 5 and 6 often get forgotten, and they're really critical. So if you seek to engage people and continue to coach them, listen to them, then the feedback and correction becomes two-way, which is great. But follow up and entrust. What I find most commonly is to follow up effectively, you've got to schedule it. I know that sounds really kind of unglamorous, but so, what we inspect gets done. What we schedule actually happens. And so following up is really critical. And then at some point, to move past just engagement and move into entrustedness, turn it over to people who are truly able and ready to fully own something, run with something, create something, innovate, because that only deepens, again, back to the top engagement. And it kind of becomes a circular thing. Maybe I should have done that more as a circular thing than a list thing. So.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I want to kind of expand on that point 5 of follow-up where you said, scheduling. Often what I've found is if you have routines, then just stuff happens. It's like if you clean your room or clean your house, once a month or once a week or whatever, it's going to happen. And it's kind of the same thing relationally. I highly recommend anyone who's supervising direct reports that you have, either weekly or bi-weekly meetings that are scheduled, one-to-one check-ins in addition to team meetings. There's a lot of people who are extroverts and they're like, okay, we're going to have our team meetings and we get everything done then. That's great, but you also need one-to-one time. So one of the things that we provided this week is a template from a book called Mastering the Management Buckets. And it's basically a one-to-one check-in template. You don't have to exactly use that template, but the idea is there's certain things you want to cover during those check-ins. And part of what I really like about that template, now the trick is actually getting this to be followed. Like one of the things that he had in his check-ins was he essentially asked his employees, do you have any concerns about our relationship? Is there any way I offended you? Is there any way I encouraged you in the past week? So that way you kind of follow, one of the things we teach in counseling is the 0-1-0 principle of conflict. And you start off with no conflict with someone, you have one conflict, and then you bring it up, you ask for their forgiveness, and then you go back to 0. What usually happens in most unhealthy organizations and relationships is you go 0, 989, explosion, and then you never forgive, right? So, and part of the idea, I'll have things, and I've actually been really surprised at the things that I do that, offend people. I mean, some things I'm like, okay, that was obvious. I was just, being stupid. But other times there's things that will offend people that I would have had no idea that offended them. And then they bring it up, and then, we're done afterwards. So I think that having those things that are scheduled, having rituals, with our staff, making sure that we have, prayer time at each staff meeting in addition to, staff time, because prayer time adds the relational element, and it's not just for God, it's also for praying for one another, right? And you're building in the relational time. So,
Yep.
all
I
right.
think another great question, Andrew, I love that you brought that up, is just what do you need? What do you need from me? Because people they're a little bit sketchy again to really trust, like you said, if in counseling and stuff, if they hear, have I done anything to offend you? Those people that don't yet trust you are not
Right.
going to tell you that because they think they're going to get in trouble for it. So sometimes, as you intuit where the relationships may be, you may want to start with,
Yeah.
what do you need from me? What can I do for you this week?
Yeah, yeah, and I didn't ask this as direct question, but often whenever I intuited that something was off, I would say, I would ask directly, how are we doing? How is our relationship? And then that kind of gives people open the floor. Now, what I found is for more than half the people who come from abuse backgrounds, they just never bring that up because if they haven't done it for the first like 30 years of their life to ever, proactively address conflict, you're probably not going to be the first person they do it with usually, but maybe they will. I mean, I've had some people where I was the first person they did it with. Yeah, so I think that can help. So.
Great. Just very, very quickly, this slide is a general kind of approach to often how we engage with others and interact. There are times when we do things to people, we do things for people, we do things with people, and we don't do them at all. Now, I will say, objectively speaking, that there's probably a valid reason to do all of these at some points in time with different people based on the relationship or the nature of the relationship at the given time. With an employee, this is really meant to create some mindfulness that in your interactions, depending on the context, what's going on, and what you need the outcome to be, you want to be mindful of whether or not you're engaging with them in a to, for, with, or a don't. Because you want to reconcile your approach in your conversation and your communication to align with what you have as the best outcome for the individual and overall for what needs to happen within, maybe the role, the job, the responsibility, the corrective action, the stepping up, etc. So it's meant to be a mindfulness.
Yeah, well, Angie, this has been really great. I think this is good to fit kind of in between. Okay, so you do this onboarding process and it gives, a series of steps. And then, later we have things like employee development and training, and we have things on in performance evaluation. But those, and then in the end, we have, how do you do employee correction and termination? But those are kind of, and this is what comes in between. It's the day-to-day relationship. And I think these are some great principles to apply in the day-to-day relationship as you're managing employees. So thanks a lot, Angie.
Sure.